We're all developers here, right? No IT pros in the room? Phew, okay, good. So what we're going to talk about in this hour is SharePoint Apps and the migration from where we've been to SharePoint Apps, talk about the whys, the whens, the when not tos. And as basically as much as I can give you from what I've learned over the last year and a half working with the SharePoint app model. Now, as we go through the talk here, I guess I'll introduce myself, Ted Pattison. I run a company called Critical Path Training out of the States. And we're, much like Combined Knowledge, we care about quality. We do a lot with SharePoint. We have hands-on training classes, remote training classes, SharePoint courseware. If anyone does teaching interested in courseware, there's some information up there. Okay, but enough about me. What are we going to talk about? Well, we'll kind of start with why Microsoft has done this 180 and kind of flipped the whole SharePoint development strategy over to SharePoint apps. Just gotta have a show of hands. How many people here have created SharePoint apps already, done any type of SharePoint app development? Okay, and then how many people are fairly, for the most part, brand new to SharePoint app development? Okay, and then just for the statistics, so I can get the right skew, how many people will never raise their hand no matter what question that I ask? Okay. IT pros, people don't raise their hand. Developers, you always get at least 13 people raising their hand on that one. Okay, so let's kind of start with this idea of the transformation of the SharePoint platform. So in the beginning, we had SharePoint as a server-side product. We'd install the thing. We'd basically grow out a farm. And today, we have to call that the on-premises model because it's this secondary model to what Microsoft is pushing. So now what we've seen is that within Microsoft, coming from Steve Ballmer, from the top down, there's this big push. And the thought behind it is if we stay the same, product-based company that we've always been, we're not going to be here in a decade. We've got to move and transition, into a cloud-based company that sells services and licenses, or services and subscriptions, not so much products and licenses. And so many teams, including the SharePoint team, has had a lot of pressure to transform themselves. Okay. But the problem is, here's where we started. And so now what we see is we're going through this metamorphosis where there's this big push to make SharePoint work in the cloud, in Office 365, and particularly with SharePoint Online. Now, it started back in SharePoint 2007, where they had something called BPOS. So they take SharePoint and Exchange, a couple other server-side products, and they bundle them together, and they have this cloud-based presence. And then to your company, they'll sell subscriptions to one user, 100 users. What they're hoping is tens of thousands of users. And so what they saw in both SharePoint 2007, which was in BPOS, and then they switched the name over to Office 365 with SharePoint 2010, that there were a lot of growing pains in the platform trying to make it work in the cloud in a hosted environment such as SharePoint Online. And they made a couple modest modifications to the platform, for 2007 and 2010. But we can really say 2013 was the version of SharePoint that from the get-go, from the first day on the whiteboard as they were designing this thing, they basically said, we're going to get serious about changing this platform and fixing the problems that do not work in the cloud. And so what the goal is, eventually, is to have the butterfly fly out. I think many of us now kind of feel that we're still kind of in the cocoon, especially as we go through this talk. Are you an optimist? Yeah, I see the glass half full. Just the water's kind of tainted with botulism. So as we go through here, you're going to see that not everything is perfect the way it should be. Well, let's kind of start out. Put yourself in the head of the people who were making these decisions about changing the platform. So what do we got going on with these SharePoint development folks? Well, we have SharePoint solutions. So whether we're creating farm solutions or sandbox solutions, your custom code runs inside the SharePoint environment, and that's going to pose risks. We don't write perfect code. People don't know how to dispose things properly. There's all kinds of other things, that make custom code running inside the SharePoint environment less than stable and less than performant. Another problem is that even though in theory you write your code against a DLL, and they should be able to swap in version 2 of the DLL against the same code, and it should work in theory, it just doesn't work in practice. And so what we find is when you write your farm solution or sandbox solutions against Microsoft.SharePoint.dll for SharePoint 2007 or 2010, you can't just swap it over and use it with the next version. We've basically got to get the developers to open the project again, go against the new version, fix everything up. And so what Microsoft was seeing is that companies were delaying migration to the next version of SharePoint months and years because of this blockade of the farm solutions need to be updated before we can move across. Okay, now, security is a huge issue. Now, what we have with SharePoint solutions is basically your code runs as a specific user under that user's identity and with that user's permission. Okay, now, they tell us that sandbox solutions are safe. Use a sandbox solution, you can't get in trouble. Okay, that's bunk. Let's say that I'm a malicious developer and I've tricked you to upload my sandbox solution and activate it in your site collection. Okay, true, I can't attack the farm. True, I can't have access to any other site collection. But let's say I put some feature activation code. Who does my feature activation code run as? It runs as you. For you to activate my solution, you have to be a site administrator. My code starts running as a site administrator, and I can delete every single piece of content in your site collection, and there's nothing you can do to stop me. So that's a potential problem. Now, there's other problems where when you run as the current user, we just talked about the too many permissions problem. How about the too few permissions problem? So there's this problem where I need to do something in my code. I need to create a list. However, the current user is a contributor. Current user can create a list item, but not a list. And so my code that attempts to create a list fails. There's no way to elevate inside the sandbox, so you're just out of luck. Okay, how about a farm solution? Farm solution. Yeah, there's that SP security run with elevated permissions. Okay, how many people in this room have called that method? Shame on you, you're the problem. You knew that was coming. So when you call run with elevated permissions, all of a sudden you stop running as that pesky little user and you start running as SharePoint/system, and what can you do? Anything that you want. And if you go ahead and go into central admin or you go into some other site collection and you start doing a bunch of work to make havoc, and later they come back and audit you, hey, someone's been a really bad boy. Who's it been? Oh, it's this SharePoint/system guy. We better go ahead and fire that guy. Okay. So what we have is we have this very limited issue where you can't really have the custom code from a developer run separately from the user, except throwing that Frankenstein switch and running as SharePoint/system. So what we really need is we need the code to have some set of permissions that we assign to it that are independent of the permissions of the current user. And there was just basically no way to address that type of issue with the current solutions models. Okay. Do we even have to get into how SharePoint solutions are hard to install, hard to manage? Okay. A lot of us came from .Net, we got into SharePoint. And in .Net, we learn all these lessons about, okay, you have a DLL, it's got a version number, you build a client, the client gets kind of a hard-coded version number of the DLL it compiled against, and .Net will never load a more recent version unless you put file redirects somewhere, typically in the web.config file. So in SharePoint, we found dealing with assembly redirects is just far too difficult. I don't know really anyone in a large production environment that does that. So what do? We have version 1, version 2, version 3, and they're all version 1.000. So .NET gives us great versioning, but we blow it off. We can't use it. SharePoint makes it too difficult. And how about the whole idea of, well, the farm solution has to be installed by the administrator of the farm. That poses issues. Sandbox solutions try to make it better, but then you just have business users going on the internet, finding these WSP files, uploading them and activating it. So we just need a much better model for that. So when they started building the SharePoint app model, here are some of the assumptions that went into their design. Well, first of all, these things have to run in SharePoint Online and in SharePoint on premises. Okay, you didn't hear it from me, but if they have to run someplace that's a little bit better, it probably should be Office 365. Okay, now, app code is never going to run in a worker process that is launched and managed by SharePoint, which basically means your custom code can run in the browser, write all the JavaScript that you want, or it can run server-side, but your process can't be a SharePoint process. We have to find ways to basically stand up external websites, and then they run outside of SharePoint, which in some ways is a little bit difficult to get up and going, but in other ways it's very freeing, because then you don't have to worry about making sure you call dispose, or can I call across the network? So, what we're going to find is that's, both an advantage, and a little bit of a limitation as far as learning curve goes. Okay, now the apps, if they have custom code that can never run inside of SharePoint, we can never reference Microsoft.SharePoint.dll or any other server-side assembly. And so all my communications with SharePoint to create lists and create list items has to be through web service calls. So what Microsoft had to do is they had to take the client-side object model, CSOM, that in SharePoint 2010 basically just covers SharePoint Foundation, but doesn't get into the SharePoint server stuff. And they basically had to extend it. And if they did, the app model wouldn't have worked. And if you're still writing farm solutions, that's a benefit from you, because there's a lot more ability for you now to call into SharePoint to get to things like user profiles and manage metadata and doing searches that weren't possible before. And also, to complement the client-side object model, they've also created parallel REST APIs. So what's the big benefit of REST APIs? The two benefits to me are, one, quite often it's much easier to call from client-side JavaScript. And then two, for server-side code, the client-side object model is great if you're running .NET, but basically is impractical to even attempt to use if you're not using .NET. So by adding REST entry points, what we see is they open up all these non-Microsoft, non-Windows platforms that can now be, first-class consumers in communicating with SharePoint, talking to the client, or the REST APIs. Okay, now here's a big one. App code is always going to be authenticated, meaning that when you write code inside of an app and you call into SharePoint, your code is always going to be authenticated, and your app takes on an identity. And what's nice about that is that then they can have a permissions model where an app has to request permissions to be able to do something like create a SharePoint list, and some user has to grant the app permissions. Doesn't matter what the current user can do, the app needs permissions for your app code to be able to do something. So that's far better than anything that we have with SharePoint solutions. Now, we'll also see that they have a much more organized or sensible way to distribute apps and install them. So they're always published through this paradigm with a catalog. And once they're published to the catalog, they can be installed, they can be upgraded. And I'm going to walk you through how all of that works. Okay, so going forward, what you're going to see is that there's really two strategic ways to develop for SharePoint now. Farm Solutions and SharePoint Apps. And then the older style of the sandbox, Microsoft is saying deprecate it. Okay, what does that really mean? Well, if you look at things like MSDN, quite often you'll see these things saying, always use a SharePoint app. Okay, now what I want you to really do is differentiate between you and your company's interests and SharePoint's interests. What is the SharePoint and the Microsoft's team's interest? To take all of us that are on premises and move us over to Office 365 tomorrow. That's never going to happen. Okay. So, should you stop doing farm solutions? Absolutely not. You're going to continue to work on premise. Many of us are never going to go to Office 365. We're just basically too dug into the on-premises model. So anyone who's recommending get away from farm solutions, to me, is thinking about Microsoft interests, not your interests. So farm solutions, still very strategic. The fact that Microsoft came out and said the sandbox is deprecated says one thing to me. It says we're going to provide full compatibility, so if the sandbox solution worked in 2010, it's going to work in 2013. But once we say deprecated now, in the next version, if we just totally take it away and it's not there anymore, don't complain to us. We told you it was deprecated. So to me, the writing's on the wall to stop working with sandbox solutions, even though they work fine with this version of SharePoint. Okay. Now, farm solutions versus SharePoint apps. Okay, well, let me ask you this. If you are the subject, what do you like better, sex or phone sex? Okay, think about that. Don't make a rash decision. If you are the parent of the subject, what would you prefer the subject has, sex or phone sex? So what we have here is this issue where farm solutions are great, and they have all the strengths and all the weaknesses that they've had before. Now, there's so many companies that started with farm solutions in SharePoint 2007. Sure, it's painful, but these companies have already been through the learning curve. And they already have the dev farm and the staging farm and the production farm. And they basically know how to do the Q&A and how to push things out. So to me, there's no problem, continuing to work with farm solutions. What you're going to find with SharePoint apps is they go up to the scope of the site collection. And then in Office 365, there's a little bit of wider scope at the tenancy. But anything that you want to do that manages site collections within a web application or does any type of farm admin work, you got to use farm solutions for those. And there's a host of things like timer jobs, claim providers. The list goes on of components that you can only create with farm solutions. So there'll still be lots of farm solution development. It's not going away. But what you'll find is that SharePoint apps give us more protection. So in one, your code runs inside of SharePoint. The other, your code runs outside of SharePoint. What you're going to see is that in SharePoint farm solutions, we have event handlers, high performant. The new model for SharePoint apps gives us remote event handlers, but SharePoint has to call out to a different website. And so they're not going to be as performant. Are there guarantees that when they call out to my remote event handler that it doesn't fall on the floor? Absolutely not. So you're not going to be creating high-performance, reliable systems with these remote event handlers and doing the same kind of things that you could do with farm solutions, and the event handlers that you're used to. Okay, but what's nice about SharePoint apps is that you have this independence from SharePoint. You run outside of SharePoint. You can basically call anywhere on the internet that your environment allows you to call. And when you want to interop with other systems, you're going to have a far easier time doing that with this new app model. Okay, before I leave the slide, you're on a business trip. You call your partner, coming home tonight. How about some sex? And your partner might say, do you mean on-premises sex? Okay, just kidding. Let's keep going here. Now, to understand apps, you have to understand this notion of a tenancy. So up in Office 365 and SharePoint Online, the last thing Microsoft wants to do is have customers kind of looking around at the farm or the web application. So those are abstracted away. And so what they've created is this concept of a tenancy, which is basically just a set of site collections that the customer has access to. So if you go to Office 365 and you create an account, you or someone else will be assigned the tenant administrator, and you'll go to a tenant site collection, and that'll give you the ability to create other site collections inside there. But you can see that the app model was really kind of built up on this idea of the tenancy. Now, what about tenancies for on-premises farms? It has to be there, but it's largely a behind-the-scenes kind of thing. So let's say that you've built an on-premises farm with SharePoint 2010, and you want to start doing app development against your local farm. So there's two services. I believe Steve Smith has a session where he's going to drill down on a lot more detail on creating and managing these. But there's something called the App Management Service, which is new to SharePoint 2013. And it's a service application that has a database behind it. And every time an app gets installed, an entry goes inside there. And there's also something called App Security Principles. It has to manage those. It manages licensing and things such as that. Now, there's also something called the Site Subscription Setting Service that existed in SharePoint 2010. It was mainly created for Office 365 because it's the thing that manages tenancies. So in an on-premises farm, you have to create an instance of the service app. You can't create it through central admin. You have to create it through PowerShell. But when you create it, it automatically creates this farm-wide default tenancy. So really, you just have to create the service and not much else. Okay, now with apps, they have to be installed in a particular SharePoint site. You know how SharePoint sites, we call them sites, we call them webs? Well, the terminology of this new app model kind of calls them webs. Now, you have a web where you install the SharePoint app. It could be a top-level site, could be a child site, doesn't matter. But then what's going to happen is when you install it in that particular site, there's going to be links to get out to the app's start page. And there's two different ways to install a SharePoint app. When you're doing development and you hit F5 with Visual Studio, it's always going to be a site-based installation. It'll install on one particular site, and you'll go to the site contents page, and you'll click, and you'll get out to the SharePoint app. Now, the place that you redirected to get to the app, or the place that the app is kind of serving up content to, that's what we call the host web. Now, instead of installing at the site level, imagine a scenario where we have 1,000 users, we have 100 sites within 10 site collections. We don't want lots of users installing the same app everywhere. So we also have a tenancy-based installation. And the idea of a tenancy-based installation is you install it one time in a special place called the app catalog that I'll show you in just a little bit. And then you can configure that app to become available in basically any site throughout a web application. So the tenancy installation is probably what we're going to do in most large environments, just because it relieves the need for basic business users to install apps, and we don't have to install one app many different times. Okay, now we also differentiate between two different idea of a SharePoint hosted app is when the app gets installed, it adds its start page and any other related resource, such as CSS files and JavaScript files, into the SharePoint environment. So it doesn't need anything outside of SharePoint. Now, the way it works is when the app gets installed, right below the site where the installation takes place, during installation, SharePoint creates this special child site that we call the app web. And it adds the start page and various things inside there. Now, SharePoint hosted apps can only have client-side code. So JavaScript and jQuery are two just absolute requirements for you to get up to speed on if you're not there already. And then lots of other related JavaScript libraries. People are using things like JS Render, Knockout, and kind of the list goes on of all these extra JavaScript libraries that just make your life much, much easier. Okay, now we have cloud-hosted apps. The difference between a SharePoint-hosted app and a cloud-hosted app is that the start page for the cloud-hosted app doesn't live in SharePoint, it lives somewhere else, in an external website, and you get to decide what type of site, what platform to build it on, and where it's going to be deployed. Okay, now we have a special name, for the site that holds the start page in a cloud-hosted app, which is the remote web. Now, unfortunately, the name cloud-hosted app can be confusing, because what you might have is you might have a cloud-hosted app that you run in your on-premises environment. So you have your SharePoint farm, and then you stand up another web server, and you run the remote web out of there. Hey, that's not in the cloud. Yeah, okay, but it's still called a cloud-hosted app. So just realize that cloud-hosted app just means that you have a server-side presence that runs outside of the SharePoint environment, and that is where your start page lives. The big benefit is that you can have server-side code in addition to client-side code. And it's possible, as you build the remote web, to build it using any web technology. You like PHP, you like Ruby on Rails. And I think you'll see a couple different sessions where they show that here. Of course, the easiest path is to use an ASP.NET app, because Visual Studio just kind of hands you so many things for free if you go down that road and you build out your remote web with an ASP.NET for application. Okay, so if we want to just kind of do hello world, we have an app start page. Every app. Let me go ahead and we have some type of a test site that we're going to use. So we'll start Visual Studio and we'll call new project and we'll go ahead and create an app. And I'll just call this one the Hello app. And when I create this app right here, you can see that Visual Studio gives me a couple different choices. What is the test site that I'm going to be using? Do I want a SharePoint hosted app? It turns out that auto-hosted and provider-hosted are just two different variations on the cloud-hosted app, and I'll differentiate between those in a second. But let's pick SharePoint hosted. Now, it turns out that if you're doing farm solutions, development doesn't really change. You need a local farm. If you're doing SharePoint App Development, you now have the ability to do remote development. I have Visual Studio and nothing else on this machine, and the SharePoint farm lives over there. Obviously, they had to work that out to make the Office 365 SharePoint Online Development story work. But the idea is if in the SharePoint farm that's not on the same machine that's running Visual Studio, you have this special type of site, which is called a developer site. You can point to it, hit F5, and Visual Studio can reach across the network and install the app with a site-based installation inside there. When you see the developer site, it's got other things in it, but the one thing that is interesting about it is what allows remote development. I can do basically development against a team site, but only in a local farm. That's what I'm going to do here. Okay, so let's go ahead, choose Finish, and of course, Visual Studio creates a new SharePoint hosted app that I don't have to write any code in. I can just hit the F5 key, it's going to work. Let's take a quick look at some of the pieces that they have created for me inside here. So they've created this page inside. Let's go ahead and make a couple changes right here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make a change. With learn jQuery at the same time. I think a lot of the other JavaScript libraries are kind of nice to have skills, but JavaScript and jQuery to me are mandatory skills. So this is the jQuery way to write a piece of code that's going to fire right when the page has loaded and the DOM is ready for access. So if I come up here and I reference that results div inside there, and then I just do something such as text equals hello sp evo, and now that we have that inside, let's go ahead and just run this right here. I'm going to hit the F5 key, and as I hit the F5 key, what it's going to do is it's going to install the app in that target site. Now, it also hits a page in the test site to redirect it automatically to the start page of the app. But if I want to look at the user perspective, let's go back to the site here. So the idea is that when an app has been installed, the user is going to have different options, but by going to the site contents page, there's the Hello app. They can click on that and get to the start page inside there. Now, what are you going to do in the start page beside here? You know, that's up to you. One very important requirement for every SharePoint app is that on its start page, it has to have a link back to the host web. Okay, So now you've kind of seen the hello world, how to get up and going inside there. Now, as I mentioned, there's 3 different hosting models. Well, there's the SharePoint hosted app. Everything lives in SharePoint. That's what I just demoed. We also talked about cloud hosted apps that have a remote web. And there's 2 different types. Provider hosted apps, which you can use for on-premise app development or for SharePoint Online development. And then there's auto-hosted apps that only work in the Office 365 SharePoint Online environment. Well, let's start with provider hosted apps. The idea of a provider hosted app is that, and I'm sorry, this is the wrong graphic there. Let me jump over here. A provider hosted app has a remote web. And the idea is that when you create a provider hosted app with Visual Studio and you hit the F5 key, it's able to create an ASP.NET project and run it in your local host URL. And so you can do all your testing there. But before you can actually ship and start installing that app, that remote web has to be stood up somewhere on the network or somewhere on the internet. Now, if you have something like an on-premises provider hosted app, you might just basically stand up a web server, deploy an ASP.NET app in there and be done with it. And then you can install the app. And the idea is that in SharePoint, when someone clicks on the start page, they'll be redirected to your web server that's running somewhere inside of your local network. However, let's say that I got $ in my eyes, and my vision is create a provider hosted app, put it up into the Office store, which is Microsoft's public catalog, that any developer who goes through, a couple different hoops could basically publish apps inside there. And if I'm going to do that, well, now I can basically stand up my remote web somewhere on the internet and make it accessible to everybody. Okay. Well, what if I'm wildly successful? And one customer with an Office 365 tenancy installs it, then a second, then a third, then a 10th, then a 100th. I've got this scenario where I have lots of customers, each one with many different users that are all coming in through the exact same entry point. And so as you start working with provider hosted apps, typically you're going to have a database behind it. It's not just standing up the remote web, standing up the database. How are you going to scale? That's up to you. Do you have a plan for scaling when you go from 10 to 100 to 1,000 to 10,000 users? Who's going to plan for disaster recovery? Who's going to back up and restore the database? That's up to you. And then also, when you work with multi-tenancy, you have this concern of, what if customer 1 looks at a page and sees the financial information for customer 2? Obviously, that's not a good idea. Something wrong happened. And so when we start doing multi-tenant designs, quite often we have to get into complicated scenarios where we never put data from 2 different customers in the same table, or maybe even the same database. And there could be policies or even government regulations that prohibit that. Okay, so now that we've seen a couple of the different issues with multi-tenancy, let's talk about auto-hosted apps. Once again, auto-hosted apps are only supported in Office 365 and SharePoint Online. They're not supported on-premise. And Microsoft hasn't really made any statement whether they're working towards supporting them on-premise in future versions. But the idea is that when I package up my app, not only does it have the stuff to install the app into SharePoint, it also has an ASP.NET project for the remote web. And so when I install it up into the Office 365 environment, it's able to reach into the app packaging, get the information, basically the start page and all the related files, and then there is a private integration between Office 365 and Windows Azure. It automatically creates, a web role and deploys the remote web for you automatically. So that's always going to happen with an auto-hosted app. You can take it one step further, and you could use this auto-provisioning process in Windows Azure and create 1 or more SQL Azure databases as well. So one nice thing about going with the auto-hosted app is that the developer doesn't have to worry about standing up the remote web, doesn't have to worry about scaling, doesn't have to worry about paying some kind of monthly service fee. That's all pushed to the customer who pays Office 365. Okay. So basically, those are our 3 different choices. We have the SharePoint hosted app, we have the provider-hosted app, and we have the auto-hosted app. Okay, now, what are some of the differences between these? SharePoint-hosted apps, cloud-hosted apps. So SharePoint-hosted apps, custom code is limited to client-side JavaScript. And if you're the JavaScript master, you might not feel limited. If you're new to JavaScript and you can code C# in your sleep, you're going to feel pretty limited at first. What's nice about a SharePoint-hosted app is there's no explicit security programming. I remember app calls have to be authenticated, and with SharePoint-hosted apps, it just works. Behind the scenes, it's magic. Okay. Well, it requires a current user. A user always has to be there to hit a page or click a button for anything to happen. Okay. But what's nice is there's no remote web, so there's no setup or management costs for hosting an external website. Another thing I throw for SharePoint-hosted apps is you can create a SharePoint-hosted app that just works across the Office 365 on-premise boundary, which is usually not the case for cloud-hosted apps. Okay, cloud-hosted apps are beneficial because you can write server-side code, and if you have a Dotnet project, write all the C# code you want, use all the different C# tricks and Dotnet framework tricks that you've never been able to use in SharePoint before. Okay, some of the downsides is it is going to require explicit security programming and the management of access tokens. It supports remote event handlers, app lifecycle events. For instance, let's say that when someone installs your app, you want to write some code to basically reach back into the host web and create 3 document libraries and then download a whole bunch of starter documents. You can't really do that in a SharePoint hosted app because there's no hook to run code as the app gets installed. Cloud-hosted apps have the hook where you basically have SharePoint call into your remote web, and that gives you the hook where you can call back into SharePoint and start doing work. Okay, another nice thing about cloud-hosted apps is it doesn't require a current user. So if you want to have a batch process that kicks off every night at midnight and writes back into the SharePoint host to maybe update documents that are inside there, that works fine. And then also, sometimes what you'll find is that the user has permissions and the app has permissions. And in a SharePoint hosted app, both the user and the app both require a permissions to do something. You want to create a list. Your app needs permissions to create the list. But even if your app has permissions and the current user doesn't, it's a no-go. You can't do it. In a cloud-hosted app, when you have server-side code, you have the ability to run with app-only identity, which basically is your trick to elevate. I don't care about the permissions of the current user. I want to lose the identity of the current user and just run with app-only permissions. And if the app has permissions but the user doesn't, that's the only way you can do that, is by running with app-only identity, which is available in server-side code, but not client-side code, which means it's available in cloud-hosted but not SharePoint-hosted apps. Later today, Chris O'Brien has a great session. He's going to drill down on SharePoint-hosted apps, get into a lot of neat scenarios. So I would encourage you to go and see that. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about just basic SharePoint development of the new app model. So what we're going to see is that whenever you create an app, there's this app manifest. And if I go back over to my little demo right here, let's go ahead and stop. Every time you create an app, there's always going to be this app manifest. If I double click on the app manifest, there's a friendly little designer that looks great when you run above 1024 by 7680. Tokens. For instance, what is the start page? Well, the start page can't be known at development time if it creates the app web at installation time. So SharePoint supports dynamic tokens such as ~app web URL. And the idea is when you install the SharePoint app, SharePoint reads that out of the manifest and leaves it inside here. And as it creates the URLs at runtime, it takes the URL to the app web and puts it inside there. There's the exact same thing with the remote app URL. Now, unlike the app web URL, the remote app URL is sometimes replaced by SharePoint, but sometimes it's replaced by Visual Studio. Now, if you have a provider-hosted app and you hit the F5 key, well, it's going to basically look to the project that has your remote web and find the URL and just basically replace that inside there. However, by the time you actually ship and want to deploy things, you're going to have to get rid of the remote app URL and replace it with the actual URL where your remote web is stood up on the internet or on the local network. Well, how about the auto-hosted app? Auto-hosted apps have remote webs, but the URL is not known till installation time because they're created on the fly. So in the case of an auto-hosted app, the remote app URL token goes into SharePoint, and SharePoint's the one that replaces it. So just don't make assumptions about, who's replacing this or when, or at least kind of get on top of those particular details. Another thing that you're going to see is that when you do this type of development, you're going to have this capability to get information from the query string. Let's say I go back here and we go to a particular app inside here. Let me go one more time. See, there's the standard tokens. Let me go ahead and hit the F5 key. And so what I want to show here is if I go to the very end of this URL, there's this big, long query string inside here. And so there's a lot of important things that are going to be inside this. Now, instead of you having to kind of hard code what these things are inside, I think you're going to find that the standard practice of you basically just adding in that token and then having it replace it with all these different things, is just kind of the standard practice inside here. Also, what you're going to see is that the things that are always there, I found, are the SP host URL and the SP language. And the other things are going to differ depending on the scenario, and they differ between on-premise and SharePoint Online. But they always have to pass the SP host URL, because remember, your app and its start page always needs a back pointer, to get back to the host web, and that's always passed inside there. So once again, that's why we generally just include the standard tokens, because all these query string parameters are just added automatically on the fly by the SharePoint environment. Okay, now, some of the other things that you're going to note here is that the app web gets created during app installation. Okay, makes a lot of sense. And let's say that I have a site, which is the site I'm installing it, which is http://internet.wingtip.com. So let's say that it creates this child site for the app web, and you might expect it to be at internet.wingtip.com/appweb1. Turns out that it's not that straight ahead. So when you look at the URLs, they're going to take on this strange form. Now, once again, let's kind of see that in action. I'll go back into this demo. I'll go back, and here I am at Wingtip server. I go out to my app, and it automatically switches. Why does it do that? It does that to give us isolation. The idea is every time you install a SharePoint hosted app or a cloud hosted app that creates an app web, which is possible, it's going to create a unique domain for that particular app. And the idea is that anytime a piece of JavaScript on a page in that app calls back into SharePoint, SharePoint can say, hey, this maps to a domain that I created for app 23. I'm going to automatically authenticate this call as app 23. Now, if it instead, just basically did wingtip server/appweb1, the JavaScript could call back into the host web, and SharePoint wouldn't know it was the app and not just JavaScript code behind the page. So the app authentication mechanism, relies on this isolation to work properly. And what we're going to see is that we kind of just have to get used to app webs having these strange looking URLs, and things like wingtip tenant, the first part, and apps.wingtip.com, those are configurable. The thing in the middle here, the app UID, gets created on the fly. And then the last part is just the name of your app as it exists in the app manifest.xml file. Okay, now, when you create an app, what's the user interface consist of? You got a start page. Every app has to have a start page. There's two other things. Unfortunately, within the 1 hour I have, I can't get into demoing these other pieces. But you have something called an app part. And the idea of an app part is that you have a page in the app web or the remote web, and you want to show that just as a rectangle somewhere in the host web. So app parts are implemented using client web parts. And once the app gets installed, you can go to the host web and go to a wiki page or a web part page and say, add web part. And you're going to see the client web parts that are available. You'll add them. It's just the code doesn't run inside of SharePoint. The code runs outside, and they just basically iframe the UI inside there. There's also something called a UI custom action. And so your app can also add UI custom actions, kind of like we've been adding with Farm Solutions, but far more limited. There's basically two things that you can do. You can add buttons to the ribbon for a list, or that drop-down ECB menu. You can basically create a custom UI action based on content type or list type or file extension. And the idea is that when you click on one of those, it's going to redirect out to an entry point in your app web or your remote web inside there. Now, you will find that in a farm solution, there's 20 things that you can do with custom UI actions. In an app, there's 2 things. Furthermore, in a farm solution, when it comes to the app URL, you can play all kinds of tricks with JavaScript. When you get to the app and you try to play the tricks with JavaScript, it fails. Because if you were able to take the JavaScript from your custom UI and inject it into the host web, it would circumvent the whole authentication mechanism. So basically, you're not able to do a lot of the same tricks. Okay, so this is new. And this is what's going to take us a couple years as a community to kind of really figure out how to do ingenious things, with these 3 different app entry points that we have. Okay, now, just to give you a little bit of a sample of this, let's go ahead and go back to my demo here. So inside my demo, one neat thing about this is that you got an app web. I can add a list inside here. Let's go back here and say add new item. I just want to add a list. And the idea is when we install this app, I want to create a new list, and I'll just create a simple custom list. And my custom list, let's go ahead and just put a simple data item inside there. So if I say data and rows, and we'll have 1 row inside with the field, which is title, and we'll go ahead and put just some simple piece of data inside here, such as item 1. Okay, so it's great. When I create a SharePoint hosted app, I can basically put all this stuff, inside of the app web, lists, document libraries, custom site columns, custom content types, custom list definitions. Hey, sky's the limit. But how the heck do I get there? Okay, so here I am inside there, and there's no UI. Okay, so here's the point. SharePoint, to date, has been a suitcase full of Swiss Army knives. It gives you every single option. How many times you've seen the business user, first time they see a SharePoint and they click on the thing and the ribbon shows and they just freeze up and they just don't know what to do. So there's this idea that an app should do one thing and do it well. We don't want to give the user millions of options. So the user interface out of the box basically locks the user out. User can't get to site settings. Now, this user could figure out, or you could put a link, to basically once you get to the home page right here. Okay, so now there is the base URL to the site. Okay, great. Now let's go ahead and say lists slash list one. Okay, but the point is, the user interface experience is not there. You have to start building it. Okay, so let's look at a couple different variations of what you might do. Well, let's kind of start down this road of, okay, well, let's go ahead and maybe I want to build my own app web UI. Maybe I want to build something like a custom master page. So, here is an example where you have this app web inside there. And so I have a module. I'm adding a master page, and I have a couple different pages inside here. Now, you could write some JavaScript code against the client-side object model to go to the app web and take the master URL property and flip it. But do you really want to do that? You could. But in this case right here, I'm using a different trick where all my pages, I've just kind of hard-coded to use my custom master page. Okay, so now let's go ahead, run this thing right here. And as I run this thing right here, you're going to see that it kind of gives me a couple different pages, gives me the ability to kind of go from one page to another page to a third page. I can even use a web part page and use the XSLT list view web part, to add a web part inside. That works great. Okay. But what you might also find is, why do you need to have a custom master page? Why do you need to have multiple pages? Maybe we can get by with just a single page. Okay, so let's kind of look at one other possibility. And this next possibility we're going to look at is a single page SharePoint hosted app. And in this case right here, I'm going to not just use jQuery, but jQuery UI and use the tabs element. And so now we'll go ahead and run this guy right here. And as I run this, I have just a default .aspx page. As this comes up here, you're going to see that we're able to kind of go from page to page. If you write JavaScript, a single page app is much better because your JavaScript doesn't unload and have to reload each time. You can create variables the whole time. Andrew Connell's got a great session this week on single page apps. It's definitely worth drilling down inside there. But still, you're going to find things like, oh, great, I went ahead and I used the XSLT list view web part. Ah, great. All this work is done for free until you get here and say, edit item, and boom, they bring you over to another page, and gosh, now how am I going to edit this? And then you might spend 3 weeks fixing little problems about the UI that just surfaces as you start using the XSLT list view web part and trying to make the whole UI comprehensive and consistent. Okay, so then what you might find is, let's just build the whole UI ourselves from the ground up. So with this last demo that I want to show you, let's go back here, and we're looking for the REST app demo. In this case right here, we're not going to use the XSLT list view web part. Instead, I'm just going to use a single ID of results, and I'm going to write everything in there with JavaScript. So here's just an example. Okay, don't say I didn't show you all the code. But basically, this is just an example of full CRUD, create, read, update, and delete using the REST API from the page calling inside there. Okay. So I guess the key point here is that you can't expect SharePoint to give you any UI out of the box. Whether you're doing an app web or whether you're doing the remote web, your expectation is that you should be building the UI from the ground up, which gives you a lot of responsibility, but also gives you incredible flexibility to come up with any user interface that you like. Okay, so as we go through and we start building these type of user interfaces, I think that's going to be something that's going to take us as a community a couple years, to really get good at and to have good libraries and good, online knowledge to be able to get to all these different things. Okay, let's see. I think I got just a couple more minutes. So, once again, having an app.master page, whether you create your own custom master page in the app web or go with a single app page. Also, when you go to the cloud-hosted app, your pages don't run inside of SharePoint, so you don't have SharePoint master pages. Yet you probably want to create a just standard ASP.NET master page. Now, if I show you one quick example with this, what I want to is when we're creating a remote web, and when you create a cloud-hosted app, whether it's a provider-hosted app or an auto-hosted app, what Visual Studio will do is create two different projects. And one will be the web project, which will be your remote web. And so in this case right here, I have a remote master page. And I tell you, the first time, if you've been building master pages in SharePoint and just dealing with all the weird SharePoint centricities, and then you get to create one outside of SharePoint and you don't have to deal with that, sometimes that feels pretty good. Okay. It's like hitting yourself in the head with a hammer because it feels so good when it stops. Okay, so now, here's a case where there is this special JavaScript component, which is called the Chrome control. Now, I will point out that this is optional, but the idea of the Chrome control is that you can add this component to your particular page. And the way that you create it is you call new on a JavaScript component that is in one of the .js files that is inside of the layouts directory. And some people like to link to it and pull it across at runtime. Other people like just to take a copy of it and put it in their project. I think both are reasonable approaches. But the idea is once you create the Chrome control, you simply give it some space in your UI, and then when you call new, you point it to that particular div, and it creates something where it gives you navigation facilities. It gives you the pointer back to the host web. Now, of course, if you're creating your own master page in the remote web, don't want to use the Chrome control, just build it yourself from the ground up. The one thing that you have to do is grab that query string parameter that has the host web URL so you can point back inside there. And you can do that from server-side code or client-side code. So just know that the Chrome control is an optional piece for you. The one thing about the Chrome control I'll mention is that it's able to pick up the UI from the host web. So if someone's using some kind of composed look and has an orange background, they automatically are able to pass the CSS to the Chrome control so it can kind of take on a chameleon effect and try to fit in. Some people like that. Other people say, if you want to make your site look hideous, I do not want my remote web master page to follow you. I just want one particular look. So that's kind of how you make the choice there. Okay, so last thing I'm going to talk about is SharePoint App Security. And SharePoint App Security, actually, looks like I need to go through publishing first. Now, when it comes to building apps, we have a .app file, which is basically what gets built. It's a zip file, and it always has the app manifest. If your SharePoint app creates an app web, what they do is they basically just take a WSP file with the exact same format for farm solutions, and they put that inside, and that WSP file is what's used to add elements like the start page to the app web. Now, as far as publishing apps goes, if you want to publish apps, which is the right way to deploy them in an on-premise scenario, you have to create a special site which is called an app catalog. Now, app catalogs, unfortunately, cannot be created once per farm. They have to be created once per web app. You can go to Central Admin. There's a new section called Apps, and you can basically say, create the app catalog. Once you've done that, what you're going to find is that when you go to a site as a user, and you go to Site Contents, and you say Add an App, you're going to be able to see apps that are inside the app catalog if you are a site administrator and you have permissions to see the app catalog. The other option is not to do the site-based installation, but instead to upload the app and publish it to the app catalog, and then you install the app in the app catalog. And only when you install the app in the app catalog do you have the ability to configure it so that it can be accessed by any site within the current web application. Okay, so just spinning back through a couple more slides. Once we install the app, you can go to the app and see it has a certain set of features available to it or menus. But when you install the app in the app catalog, what you'll see is that it has a deployment option. And when you click on deployment, you'll get to a page, only available in the app catalog, that then allows you to configure the app, and you can make it available to any site inside the hosting web application or to any selected number of sites and or site collections inside there. Okay. And then for upgrading, you're able to upgrade by adding the app up inside there. Now, when it comes to upgrading, let's say that you have a remote web. Nothing lives in SharePoint. You can change anything that you want inside your remote web without having to talk to SharePoint, which to me takes care of 90% of the scenarios. That farm solution stuff is tricky because you always have to talk to SharePoint when you want to fix anything. But when everything lives at SharePoint, basically just go to your remote web, fix pages. SharePoint doesn't have to know any different. It's only when you want to change the functionality for customers and have a different start page, that's typically when you need to do an upgrade. And the idea is that you would upload the second version of the .app file, and the second version of the .app file, once it gets installed, is going to overwrite the first one. And then after a little bit of time, a timer job is going to run, and it's basically going to come back, and it's going to indicate to the user an update's available. But the app model is never going to force the user to upgrade. It's based on the premise that if a user says, version 1 works, that's all I need, upgrading will only make things worse, it's basically going to force the user to upgrade if the user wants to upgrade. So if you have upgrades, you always have to have version 1 capabilities available, because you're going to have some users that upgrade to version 2, some that stay at version 1. Okay, now I'm about a minute over. And there are 2 authentication security talks. Paul Schäfflein is doing the one for S to S. I'm going to be doing one at the end of the day tomorrow on Office 365. But just kind of the short story is that when you have SharePoint hosted apps, they just work automatically. There's no need to really deal with authentication. When you have external authentication, things get to be far more challenging because your server-side code has to create and manage access tokens. And the way that you do that in the Office 365 environment and the way that you do that in the on-prem environment are very, very different. Okay, and so I can kind of encourage you to go to the 2 other talks by Paul and by myself if you're going to be doing server-side code, because it's not overly intuitive how you work with those. Okay, so unfortunately I kind of ran out of time for those last 2 things, but I'm going to be available outside the room. I'd love to answer any kind of questions you have. Hopefully this was a good introduction to the app model and getting you started thinking about apps. Thank you very much.